The black man showed up when my husband stopped looking at me. Disclaimer: this content is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. I never thought silence could be louder than words. But that's what my house had become. A place where the quiet echoed more than the laughter once did. My husband, Daniel, had stopped looking at me the way he used to. His eyes, once full of warmth and wonder, now only glanced past me like I was part of the furniture. We still talked, of course, about bills, groceries, and schedules, but somewhere between the routines, the love that held us together began to fade, slowly, quietly, almost politely. It wasn't until the new neighbor moved in that I realized how much I'd been craving to be seen again. He was a tall black man with an air of quiet confidence, the kind of presence that made people notice without trying. He didn't talk much the first few times I saw him, just nodded politely when our eyes met across the fence. But there was something in the way he looked at me, a pause, a depth, that stirred something I had long buried. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being silly, that maybe I was reading too much into it. But the truth is, when someone finally looks at you after years of being invisible, it's hard not to feel something. I started finding excuses to be outside, watering plants that didn't need water, rearranging the same pots, just to catch a glimpse of him. There was no conversation, no flirting, just the quiet acknowledgement of two lonely souls crossing paths at the wrong, or maybe the right time. Daniel didn't notice at first. Or maybe he did, but pretended not to. Our marriage had become a fragile truce, built on unspoken disappointments and polite distance. I kept telling myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong, that it was harmless. But deep down, I knew something was changing inside me. The more I tried to resist, the more drawn I became to that feeling. The feeling of being noticed, of being alive again. Then one afternoon, as I was standing by the fence lost in thought, I heard a voice behind me say, "You shouldn't look so sad when the sun's this beautiful." I turned, and he was standing there, closer than he'd ever been before. His tone was gentle, but his eyes said something else. Something that made my heart skip. And that's where everything began to shift. I didn't know what to say when he spoke those words. For a moment, I just stood there, holding the watering can like it could somehow protect me from the wave of emotions that hit all at once. I hadn't heard kindness in someone's voice in so long that I almost forgot how it felt. His name, I learned later, was Marcus. He had moved into the house next door just a few weeks ago, after a recent divorce. There was something both steady and broken about him, like he carried stories he didn't want to tell. Maybe that's what drew me in. That afternoon we talked nothing deep at first, just small things. The weather, the neighborhood, the noise of the street at night. But even in that simple talk there was an ease, a softness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about romance or attraction. It was about being heard. About someone actually looking into my eyes and listening when I spoke. When Daniel came home that evening, I waited for him to ask about my day. He didn't. He barely noticed the flowers I had planted or the dinner I'd made. He just scrolled through his phone and nodded when I spoke, lost in a world that didn't include me anymore. That night, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Marcus's voice. Not what he said, but how he said it. Calm, gentle, like I mattered. It scared me how much space that small moment began to take up in my mind. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that loneliness can play tricks on your heart. But the next morning, when I saw Marcus again, he smiled, and I felt something shift again, something I couldn't name. Over the next few days, it became routine. A wave, a brief talk, a shared laugh about something silly. The world around me felt a little less heavy. But with every passing day, I noticed Daniel drifting further away. He was spending longer hours at work, and when he was home, he was tired, distant, barely there. I started wondering if he noticed the distance too, or if it had become normal for him, just like it had for me. One evening, as I stood outside watering the garden again, Marcus stepped closer to the fence and said quietly, "You look like you're carrying too much." My heart skipped. I wanted to tell him everything, but I didn't. I just smiled and said, "Some days are heavier than others." He nodded, like he understood without needing more words. And that's when I realized I was at a point where something had to give. The silence at home was turning into a weight I couldn't keep carrying alone. But what happens when the only person who sees you isn't the one you promise forever to? The days began to blur into each other. Daniel's presence at home felt like a shadow there but distant. We still sat at the same table for dinner, but the silence between us grew thicker with each passing evening. Sometimes he would glance up from his phone and smile, but it was the kind of smile you give out of habit, not emotion. I started wondering when exactly we stopped being partners and became polite strangers living under the same roof. Meanwhile, my conversations with Marcus became longer. Not every day, but often enough that I began to look forward to them. He would ask questions Daniel never did, about what I liked, what I missed, what made me happy. And the strange part was I didn't have clear answers anymore. Somewhere in the routine of being a wife, I had forgotten what I loved for myself. Marcus never pushed, but he listened with a patience that made it easy to open up. One afternoon, I saw him fixing his car in the driveway. I offered him a glass of lemonade, and that small gesture turned into an hour-long talk. He told me he used to be a teacher before he moved here, that his divorce had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. His words hit deeper than I expected. There was something painfully familiar about his story, the way love fades without either person meaning for it to. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there beside Daniel, watching him scroll on his phone until he drifted off. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him how lonely it felt to be unseen, but every time I tried, the words stuck. Maybe he felt the same but didn't know how to say it either. It was easier to stay quiet than to risk another argument that ended with nothing changing. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter from Daniel. He'd gone on a 2-day work trip, something I didn't even know was planned. That's when I realized how far apart we'd grown. He didn't even think it mattered to tell me. The house felt emptier than ever. Later that evening, I found myself standing near the fence again, lost in thought, when Marcus appeared. "Rough day?" he asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I just nodded, and he said, "Sometimes, silence says more than words ever could." His words lingered long after he left. I knew I was standing at a dangerous edge, emotionally if not physically, but for the first time in a long while I felt seen, and that terrified me more than anything. It was a Friday evening when everything began to shift. The air felt heavy, like something unspoken was about to happen. Daniel was supposed to be back from his work trip, but he hadn't called or texted all day. I told myself it was fine, that he was probably tired or busy, but deep down, that same hollow ache returned. The one that came whenever I realized how little space I took up in his world anymore. I tried distracting myself, cleaning the house, folding laundry, replaying old memories that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. As the sun began to set, I stepped outside to take a breath. The light was soft, the air quiet, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. Then I saw Marcus standing by his porch, watching the sunset with that same calm expression he always had. Our eyes met, and before I could look away, he said, "You look like you're waiting for someone who stopped showing up." His words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't reply. I just looked down, but he walked closer, slow, respectful, his tone low. "You deserve to be seen, you know that?" I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened, my heart beat too fast. There was a pull, strong and undeniable, but it wasn't just about him. It was about everything I had lost within myself. I felt the walls I had built over the years start to tremble. I took a step back, trying to find my breath, but something inside whispered, "Don't run this time." Suddenly, headlights flashed across the driveway. Daniel's car. My heart sank. Marcus stepped back, his expression unreadable. Daniel got out, looking exhausted, distracted, but then his eyes caught sight of Marcus standing there. Something in his face changed. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, then at Marcus and back again. The air between the three of us went thick with tension. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence. "Didn't know you two were such good neighbors." His tone wasn't loud, but the edge in it was unmistakable. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Marcus gave me one last look, steady, calm, and nodded before turning to leave. Inside, Daniel barely spoke. He poured himself a drink and sat down, eyes fixed on nothing. I could feel anger, confusion, and something else, fear, building between us. That night, neither of us slept. The silence had turned into a storm waiting to break. The next morning felt colder than usual, even though the sun was out. Daniel didn't speak a word to me over breakfast. He just stared at his coffee, lost in thought, his silence louder than anything he could have said. I could feel the distance between us growing wider. But this time it wasn't just quiet. It was tense, heavy, almost suspicious. Every time I tried to meet his eyes, he looked away. I wanted to explain, to tell him nothing happened, that Marcus was just a friend, but something told me he wouldn't believe it. When Daniel finally left for work, I thought the weight in my chest would ease, but it didn't. The whole house felt uneasy. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. It was Marcus. He looked different, worried, distracted. "I'm sorry about last night," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." I told him it wasn't his fault, but before I could say more, he handed me something, a letter. "This isn't for me," he said, "but I think you should see it." Inside was a printed email, addressed to Daniel. My stomach turned as I read the words. It was from a woman, a coworker of his. The message wasn't romantic exactly, but it was personal, intimate in tone. It spoke of late nights at work, of things they needed to talk about in person. My hands trembled. The irony hit hard. While I'd been drowning in guilt for the attention Marcus had given me, Daniel had already been drifting somewhere else. That evening I pretended not to know. I cooked dinner, set the table, tried to keep my voice steady when he walked in. But every word between us felt staged. I kept seeing that email in my mind, wondering how long it had been going on, wondering if this was why he'd stopped looking at me long before Marcus ever arrived. After dinner, Daniel finally broke the silence. "I don't like the way that man looks at you," he said flatly. I froze. "He's my neighbor," I replied, but my voice shook. "That's all." He gave a short, cold laugh. "That's how it always starts." I wanted to shout, to ask him what his late nights were about, but I didn't. Instead, we just stared at each other across the room, both knowing the truth but afraid to say it aloud. Later, I stepped outside to clear my head, and from across the fence, I saw Marcus again. But this time he wasn't alone. He was talking to someone. A woman I'd never seen before. The way she looked at him made my heart twist in confusion. Who was she? And what was she doing there now, after everything that had just happened? I froze when I saw the woman beside Marcus. She was younger, dressed neatly, and had the kind of calm confidence that made her hard to ignore. They spoke quietly, almost too softly to hear, but it was clear there was something serious between them. I didn't know if it was romantic or personal, but it was enough to make my heart sink. For a moment I just stood there, watching them from behind the curtain, feeling foolish for ever thinking I understood what was happening. Maybe I had imagined the connection all along. Maybe he was just kind and I was just lonely. Later that evening, Marcus came to the door. His expression was gentle, but there was something final in his eyes. "That woman you saw earlier," he said before I could ask. "She's my ex-wife. She came to tell me she's moving away for good." He paused, searching my face. "I wanted to thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. But I think both of us have things we need to fix before we make new mistakes." His words landed softly, but they carried weight. I nodded, realizing he was right. What I felt wasn't love. It was a mirror reflecting all the emptiness I'd ignored for years. That night, I finally sat down with Daniel. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just truth. I told him about the loneliness, about how invisible I had felt, and yes, about Marcus. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired, the same tiredness I had carried for so long. Then, quietly, he admitted something too, that he'd grown close to a woman at work, not out of love, but because he felt unwanted at home. Hearing that broke something, but it also cleared the fog between us. For the first time in years we saw each other, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as two people who had forgotten how to care. We decided to take time apart, not out of anger, but to remember who we were before the silence took over. Marcus moved away a week later, leaving only a small note that said, "Sometimes people cross paths just to help each other see again." Months have passed since then. The house feels different now, quieter but peaceful. I've started painting again, something I'd stopped years ago. Daniel and I talk sometimes, kindly, like old friends trying to find their way back. Maybe that's what life is. A series of crossings and lessons. Some people arrive to stay, others to awaken parts of us we forgot existed. Daniel didn't speak to me that night. He went straight to the living room and sat in silence, his drink untouched on the table. The tension was thick, but beneath it was something fragile. Something that felt like sadness more than anger. I stood by the doorway, unsure whether to walk away or finally face what we had both been avoiding. After what felt like forever, he finally said, "I just don't know when we stop trying." His voice cracked a little, and that broke me more than any argument ever could. I sat down beside him, my heart racing. "Maybe it happened quietly," I said softly. "Maybe we got so used to surviving the days that we forgot how to live them together." He nodded, staring at the floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was two people standing at the edge of what once was, unsure if there was still something left to save. Then Daniel looked at me, his eyes tired but honest. "I saw the way you looked at him," he said. "And for a second I realized I used to look at you that way too." His words hurt, but they also opened a door we both had been too afraid to touch. I told him about Marcus, about how he had made me feel seen again, but also how that reflection made me realize what I'd lost within myself. "It wasn't about him," I whispered. "It was about remembering I still existed." Daniel took a deep breath. "I can't promise things will go back to what they were," he said quietly. "But maybe we can start by not pretending anymore." That simple truth felt like a small beginning. We didn't hug, we didn't make promises, but there was peace in the honesty. The next morning I went outside one last time. Marcus's house was quiet, a moving truck parked outside. He was leaving town for a new job, starting over. He waved when he saw me, and I smiled back, a silent goodbye between two people who met at the right time for the wrong reasons. Weeks passed and life slowly settled. Daniel and I began rebuilding, not as the same people we were, but as two who had finally learned to speak again. Sometimes love doesn't end. It just needs to be reminded it's still there, beneath the noise and silence. What do you think? Did she make the right choice by staying and trying again? Or should she have walked away to find herself? Tell me in the comments if you'd want to see what happens next in their story.